In the earliest 20th century, Pentecostalism sprung out of a street in California that spread soon across the entire country and around the world. Is this a legitimate Protestant movement? Caution, you're about to enter the happy-clappy zone. The Reform Factor's on for its very last episode. Welcome back to the special edition of the Reform Factor. I'm your host, Peter Bertzel. Today we will be doing our show with the other Reformation podcast known as Inadequate Minds, and we will be discussing the subject of Pentecostalism, found in chapter 15 of Mcgrath's book, Christianity's Dangerous Idea. The beginning of the 20th century saw the explosion of a movement within Protestantism known as Pentecostalism. This movement focused on the gifts of the Holy Spirit and the personal leading of God's power. This movement breathed life into a religious movement that stressed doctrinal clarity to the point of dryness and deadness. Joining me now is Aaron Legue, Tyler Frere, David Marshall, Aaron Vogie, with Isaac Henderson vacationing in Ireland. And welcome back to this very special edition of either The Inadequate Factor or The Reformed Mind, a crossover episode between our two episodes. Isaac Henderson is not with us today, but he is vacationing in Ireland, and he has so kindly called us, and he will be talking for a little bit. Isaac, are you there?
How you doing, Peter?
Hey, Isaac, could you please give us a couple of your thoughts on Mcgrath's chapter on Pentecostalism?
Well, I will definitely say that I appreciate his overview of
course you do.
Pentecostalism and charismatic movements as a whole. However, and of course this might be from a little bit of my own bias as well. I'm not a fan at all of how he depicts cessationism. He's not necessarily giving it at least a fair chance. He's not actually giving any scriptural evidences as to why this is an actual view. I mean, I don't want to put him down at all. I just, if you are going to be objective, I would, tend to look at both sides with I wanted to say without bias, but it's definitely something to consider. The Pentecostal movement. It is very large in our country, and it affects a lot of our churches, and affects a lot of the churches overseas as well. So I think it's an issue that we do need to be thinking about, Peter, and that's why I appreciate this chapter of Mcgrath, is because it actually gives it a fair overview.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us from Ireland, Isaac.
It's my pleasure, and I'll drink a Guinness to you guys.
Cheers.
All right, gentlemen, let's get into this discussion. Tyler, want to start us off? What did you think of Mcgrath this time around?
Well, anybody who's been in class with me knows that I'm not the biggest fan of Mcgrath. And something that came out in this chapter that especially stood out to me is that as he considered Pentecostalism purely as a movement and looked only at the tangible quantitative factors which contributed to the rise of Pentecostalism, especially in the 20th century, and that rise has been rapid and is not showing any signs of slowing. As he looked at those factors, he denied, or at least skipped over, any sort of providential workings in those. And I'd like to pull out a section from page 437. He's talking about how Pentecostalism has emerged in the same context and perhaps as a product of a sort of postmodern understanding of Protestantism. And he says that Pentecostals would speak of, quote, divine providence. Mcgrath is showing us right here a fundamental issue that needs to be dealt with before we even think about this chapter, or really any chapter in this book, which is that he is writing for a secular audience. And so I think that in this discussion we need to keep in mind the fact that we're dealing with a discussion that is geared toward understanding Pentecostalism simply as a movement within Protestantism, and a movement which is devoid of any sort of providential working, and honestly, any sort of doctrinal standards of right or wrong. He speaks about postmillennialism and Pentecostalism in the same context, even because he recognizes that today, at least in his mind today, Protestantism is not about right and wrong. It's about a postmodern pragmatism.
Does anybody want to build off of that?
Yeah, and he points out how it's kind of a homegrown, in fact, of America. It's homegrown in America, and it's tied to this postmodern thought. And so hopefully we'll see what happens. But as many people here living here have pointed out, postmodernism is on decline. Hopefully, so we'll see what happens with Pentecostal thought in that process. So.
All right, so I mean, do you think that he gave us the scenario where Pentecostalism did not just come out of that street in California? There was stuff going on around the globe where different movements were popping up. What did you think of that? Does there seem to be a divine providence pattern there at all? Was this just a fluke? What on earth is going on here with this movement?
I think that we need to take a couple of things into account when we consider what Mcgrath said about how Pentecostalism came from numerous places. He even suggested that perhaps it had origins in India and that it indigenously grew there. We need to take into account, first of all, a good understanding of what actually happened in history, which is that it did start in the epicenter in Azusa Street and places like that in the United States, where the Reformed tradition had been sort of subliminally derided and where tradition itself and confessionalism have been sidelined. So the truth and standards of truth grounded in traditional beliefs of Protestantism had already been undermined in the United States. And then when ideas like those espoused by Pentecostalism began to spread through missional efforts, I think what they found was just that Pentecostalism was more easily syncretized and assimilated to the cultures in which it found itself. So to say that there was, for example, Pentecostalism already in the Indian church doesn't really mean anything. It just means that the church in India was already syncretized between its pagan religions and Christianity that had been brought there, say, by British colonists.
Even a little bit of that documentary we saw a couple of weeks ago, that was the syncretism and trying to cast out demons and everything. It was definitely a mixture of local culture.
Kind of getting off of that, we see that it's like these within that we see all these different within that you see like that spread and like people making shifts and changes to fit their culture and whatnot, and they kind of pegs off of what we were going off of with the last chapter, and how it was a lot of people trying to conform Protestantism, like Christianity, to their own to fit within society. The Pentecostal movement can be viewed in that way, and it's reshaping the culture.
I found it interesting. Was it UPCI or UCPI? One or the other. They actually denied the Trinitarian God. That was sort of a shocker to me. I was like, wow, really? Where do you get grounds for this? And it's, again, Mcgrath's looking at the extremes of different denominations, the same with Pentecostalism, even so more.
To wrap up our discussion here, gentlemen, what do you think the relationship is between Pentecostal excitement that we see going on in the evangelical church today, and maybe that could just be a confusion with people wanting to be excited about their faith? I know that some people are continuationists and want to be spirit-filled because they feel closer to God, but I've always found that should be an integral part of our faith anyway. So what are we doing wrong in our churches where people are? Why is teaching doctrine become so dry and dead when doctrine is supposed to be giving life? And how can we be excited about our faith without going into the happy clappy craze?
Well, one thing I will say, and the gentleman that would usually sit in your spot, Dr. Stroll, would say, is one thing we should not do is go into the Schlumberger or the seeker-sensitive mode to try and adjust our worship services into this. Let's think about what the world would want. But on the other hand, I do think that something else that Sproul and everyone here at Living Here does do talk about is that although we're concerned with dealing with the mind, it's an issue of priority. Is we're trying to go through the mind to the heart. It's not enough just to have head knowledge, and that's something that oftentimes having a teacher or somebody that's really focused on information, trying to pastor a church, if they're not focused on getting to the heart of the issue, it can lead to a kind of dry, doctrinal, in its derogatory sense, kind of Christianity. So it's a matter of going through the heart, through the mind, to get to the heart. The problem with Pentecostalism is it tries to go the other way around. So,
The Apostle Paul tells us in his epistle to the Colossians to make the best use of the time. And I think that what we see in Pentecostalism and in mainstream Protestantism's constant leanings toward this Pentecostal assimilation to the more human factors of our faith is essentially that we want to be sheep in wolves' clothing, that we want to look as much like the world as we can and experience all of the emotional hype and the adrenaline rush of sin, if you will, but in a Christian context, a context which we call safe. It's interesting, I think, that on the very first chapter, page of the chapter, Mcgrath says that Pentecostalism's, quote, historical origins and fundamental beliefs located firmly within the bounds of Protestantism. And that's a safe place for a lot of people to know that what they believe at least started in a Protestant tradition. Now, as Aaron Vogel has told us already, things like denying the Trinity and stuff do happen within Pentecostalism, but they've still got the safety of being able to say that they have some sort of tradition, even if they wouldn't articulate it that way because of their eschewing of tradition in general.
All right, well, thank you, gentlemen, for this discussion. It's our very last episode of both of our shows. Thank you very much for joining us for this crossover.
Thank you.
And that's it for our final episode of The Reform Factor. I'm your host, Peter Bertzel, coming to you in front of the school, Reformation Bible College, next to our mentor, John Calvin. The word of the day, gimcrack. Gimcrack. That Tyler Fryer, he's such a gimcrack. Have a good day.
because we had a couple episodes of Spring.
Also, has anybody ever noticed that there is a typo on the back cover?
Really?
It says unbo unded. It does, rather than